Morning, everyone. Sorry, I'm running the IT at the same time as trying to get going here. So took me a second to get the music shut off, everything pulled up and ready to roll. So welcome. Thanks for being here. Any questions before we get started? As I mute everyone right as I said that. So any questions or anything before I jump in?
I have none, but thanks for the help the other day.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right, what Jason and I thought we'd talk about today is I'm going to pull up the REPSI here and I'll show you, we thought it would be good to go through and talk through the sale of the buyer's property section and just make sure that everyone is aware of the whole process and also the forms and things that are available that you can use as part of writing an offer where your buyer has a property that they need to sell. So where I thought I would start is just here, the sale of the buyer's property. So the buyer's ability to purchase the property, to obtain the loan referenced in 2.1C above and or any portion of the cash referenced in 2.1E above. So what that's saying is just what they've put up here in 2.1C for the new loan and 2.1E, the balance of purchase price in cash. If any part of that is conditioned upon the sale of the real estate owned by the buyer, then you have to use the subject to the sale of the buyer's property addendum. Now, we've seen a few scenarios where agents have checked the box on this, but then not actually used the addendum, or that they check the box and then they use just a blank addendum and put something in there about, buyer's property will be sold by such and such date. So just as a reminder, if you are going to check the box is on that, you automatically then have to use the subject to the sale of the buyer's property addendum as well. So let's go to that addendum and feel free to unmute and stop me if you have a question along the way as we're hitting on any of this stuff. But I'm going to scroll down here to the subject to the sale of the buyer's property addendum. So we would put this as probably addendum number 1, unless you were doing an FHA or whatever, and then it could be 1 or 2, and the FHA could be 1 or 2. But you're going to number the addendum here and then fill out all the top information like you typically would. But then right here is subject to the sale conditions. So the buyer's obligation to purchase the property is conditioned upon the closing of the sale of the buyer's property located at, and then obviously you're going to put in the property address there. And then this condition is referred to below as the subject to the sale of the buyer's property condition. Well, once we've done that, then the buyer has 2 different rights here in terms of canceling. One is it is before the due diligence deadline or the financing and appraisal deadline, whichever is later. The other one being the buyer's right to cancel after the due diligence deadline or financing or appraisal deadline, whichever is later. So if they cancel before due diligence or finance and appraisal deadline, buyer may cancel in their sole discretion. So again, just could be for any reason, if the buyer has not closed on the sale of the buyer's property, by providing written notice to the seller no later than the due diligence deadline referenced in 24B or the financing and appraisal 24C, whichever is later, and the earnest money will be released to the buyer without authorization from the seller. So if they cancel before due diligence or finance and appraisal, earnest money goes back to them. They could cancel for really, again, any reason, just buyer's sole discretion. They decide, hey, I want to cancel the property. They can cancel this contract, get their earnest money back. The second one is if they do it after. So if the buyer does not cancel the REPSI by the due diligence deadline or finance and appraisal, whichever is later, and has not closed on the sale of the buyer's property, then the buyer can cancel the REPSI on or prior to the settlement deadline by providing written notice to the seller, whereupon the earnest money will be released to the seller without authorization from the buyer. And then this is kind of the key thing that is good to remember, is the seller agrees to accept as seller's exclusive remedy the earnest money deposit or deposits as liquidated damages. So just kind of keep in mind, we don't really, it used to be in our real estate purchase contract years and years ago that if the seller took earnest money from the buyer, or the buyer got their earnest money back in an amount equal to it, that it was worded that way, is that that is their exclusive remedy. Basically what it means is if they cancel after the due diligence and finance and appraisal deadline on or before a settlement deadline, the only option the seller has is to take the earnest money. So it's not like they could try to specifically enforce or that they have other remedies available. They have already agreed that is the exclusive remedy. So that's something that is a key thing to remember on this cancellation here. So the next section down is the buyer's property listing requirements. So the buyer's property is or is not currently listed on the MLS. If it's not currently listed, then they're agreeing that it will be on the MLS within 7 days of acceptance. And then the name of the listing agent is going to go in here. The name of the brokerage will go there. And then this last is the buyer's property is or is not currently under contract with a purchaser. So that's how you're going to fill out this form. And just wanting to make sure that we're understanding how that all works, what those things look like. Now, typically what's going to happen, and looking at who's on here, I'm sure you guys are fully aware of this, but just in case somebody goes back and is watching this later on, typically what's going to happen is when an offer comes in that is subject to the sale of the buyer's residence, almost always the other side, the agent, the listing agent, is probably going to counter back with an option to keep the property on the market and the time clause addendum. So in the event that were to happen, you would counter back, obviously, the next whatever number addendum you're on, you're going to put there. And then what this addendum gives the seller the right to continue to market the property and accept other offers. And there's just I'm going to run through this, but there's a couple of things that, and specifically one that I want to make sure to point out to you guys that so that everybody understands. So first is the right to accept other offers. So the buyer and seller agree the seller may continue to offer the property for sale and accept backup offers. And then this is that key piece that I want to make sure you guys understand is then seller, in the seller's sole discretion, may notify in writing the buyer, notify the buyer in writing of an accepted backup offer. So the key thing on this here is they can continue to offer the property for sale. If they get an offer in, they don't have to then enact this time clause in place if they don't want to. So maybe the seller gets an offer in that isn't any better, or for whatever reason, the seller just feels like, I don't want to knock this first buyer out. They could accept an offer as a backup offer and not notify the buyer. So I just want to make sure that piece of it is clear, because I think a lot of times agents assume, well, we got another offer, we need to go and start this time clause, and you don't. So it's the seller, in the seller's sole discretion, may notify the buyer in writing. So if they're just going to keep it in a backup position, you don't even have to say a word to the buyer. But if they do want to enact it, then that's where we would come into this. So the buyer's right to remove the conditions. So if the seller does provide written notice to the buyer will have however many days that you decide to put in there. When I first started in real estate, we didn't even call it we called it time clause, but it was a 72-hour time clause. We always said it's the 72-hour time clause addendum, 72-hour time clause, because that's how it was. It was just everybody did 72 hours. So now we have the option of, you could say 1 day, you could say 2 days, you could say 3 days. So however many days you want to give them to respond. And I think for the most part, probably still kind of 3 days is kind of what a lot of times ends up happening. But again, whatever you want to do, I would just say give, ample time, but whatever number of days you're going to give them. So the buyer will have, let's say, 3 days after receipt of the seller's written notice to provide written notice to the seller of the buyer's removal of the following conditions from the REPC. Now, obviously, this is all going to be negotiable, but for me personally, if I'm representing my seller and I'm filling this form out, I'm going to try to put in there that if we accept this, we put the home on the market and we are going to then use this time clause. If I enact this time clause, I want you to remove your due diligence. I want you to remove your appraisal condition, and I want you to remove your financing and the subject to the sale of the buyer's property condition. So, and just another thing to point out and make sure is notice that this one is both financing and the subject to the sale of the buyer's property conditions. So I think a lot of times people will think, well, we'll just remove the subject to the sale and we could still use the financing as a way to back out. But you'll notice on this, as soon as, because if we check this box and we give them written notice, they've got to remove their financing condition as well. Okay. All right. Additional earnest money. So then it's saying, in addition to removing the above check conditions, the buyer agrees to deposit an additional earnest money in the amount of, and then you would put in however much the amount of is. And you can see on this form, it's only room for like up to $99 probably. Totally joking. But you'll see on the regular form, I don't know why this one printed that way, but you could put in whatever the earnest money is going to be. And then the buyer shall deposit the additional earnest money in the same location as the earnest money deposits within 4 calendar days of removing the above conditions. So in the event you're going to have them do an extra amount of earnest money, which again, if I'm on the seller side, I love that idea of being able to get additional earnest money. You're just really forcing that buyer's hand of, are you going to be able to get this deal done or not? And they have then 4 calendar days after removing the conditions above to get that deposited.
Hey, Russ,
right.
can I
Yes.
make a comment here?
Absolutely.
Say on the buyer side, I was on the seller side and did all of those things. And of course, the buyer's agent is like, come on, come on,
Yeah.
So, what is, I mean, even additional, didn't do earnest money, but if they could still continue on without the financing. So I actually have a seller who may be in this, but they can purchase without the sale of their house, but they would have to take out like 401k and all of these different things to do that. So I think we'd do a subject to sell unless we got in problems, but I wouldn't, waive the other conditions. Is that kind of, just, I mean,
Yep.
On both sides, you're going to be looking out for the best interest. So just on the buy side, just the financing and the subject to the sell.
Correct. Yeah. If I'm on the buy side, I'm going to say, hey, we still want to have our due diligence. We still should get a chance to do that. We still should be okay to cancel if it doesn't appraise. But yeah, the key piece on this is just really, whether you're on the buy side or the seller side of that financing, is ultimately, are you still going to be able to perform if the property doesn't sell? And really, you want to get, if you're on the sell side for sure, you want to know, like, can they really perform? But again, that's why I love the idea of the additional earnest money, is have them put their money where their mouth is on it. So, but yeah, did I answer?
Yeah. And then you just do, if they had all 3 of those and you're the buyer, you just have to counter again those. Yep. Okay.
Yep. Counter back and just say, no, buyer still has the right to cancel based on section 8.1 and the appraisal condition still applies. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thanks.
You'd want to counter that back. So good. All right. Then next is section D, is the buyer's right to not remove the conditions. So if the buyer does not remove from the REPC the above check conditions within this time specified in section 1.b of the addendum, then the REPC will automatically become canceled, in which instance the buyer's earnest money deposit or deposits shall be released to the buyer. So on this again, just keep in mind the timeframes of that, the days, so many days after receipt of the seller's notice is going to be back to day 1, day 2, day 3. So if I got it today, then tomorrow's day 1, day 2, day 3, and it's by 5 p.m. So I had, this goes back early on in my career, but an agent in the office that I was working in had done a time clause. They got another offer in, they send over the time clause, and the buyer then responded to remove their conditions. And back then, really, it was, they had 4. It wasn't just 3 options here. It was, you had the due diligence, appraisal condition, financing, and then the last one was just the subject to the sale. And they got their notice in, they felt like within the deadline. Our agent, who was the listing agent, felt like it was not within the deadline and says that, and therefore said the buyer did not remove their conditions within the time frame. Therefore, you're out. We're selling this to this other buyer, and it then became, a fight and a struggle. And I wish I could remember exactly where that ended at, but it became this struggle over it. So I would just say, kind of keep in mind that, and actually, let me back up on that. I take that back. Is what happened on that one was it was based on the time they gave notice versus the way this one's written is it's going to be 5 p.m. on whatever the date, however many days. So if we said 3 days, from today, it would be 5 p.m. The problem back then is it was 72 hours after they gave the notice. And that's where the argument came into place was, well, what time was the notice given? Was it 2 o'clock or 2:30 or 3 or whatever? And so our listing agent felt like, well, no, when I gave the notice, the clock started. And they were saying, well, we didn't actually get the notice until a different time. So anyway, I would just say on that, keep in mind that it's going to be 5 p.m. however many days after. And I would even recommend just hey, sending them a text or something and saying, hey, it's 5 o'clock. We have not received anything. We're moving on to this other offer. So, all right. So next, we're going to assume now that we did the subject to the sale of the buyer's property. We now also have this option to keep the home on the market. So there is an addendum now as well, or excuse me, not an addendum, it's a notice from the seller to the buyer that they have accepted an offer. So this would be then the time clause notice. So the seller gets in an offer, and remember, they don't have to tell the buyer and enact this time clause, but if they do, you would want to use this notice to send over this seller's notice to the buyer of an accepted offer provided by, you're going to put the seller's name, the buyer's name regarding the property, with the reference date of this, with the property address. And then you're going to say addendum number blank to the REPC contains an option to keep the house on the market. So whatever addendum number this was is the one you're going to list right here. So you're saying that option to keep the house on the market or the time clause. This seller's notice informs the buyer that the seller has accepted an offer subject to the rights of the buyer provided in the REPC, and the buyer is advised that upon receipt of this notice, buyer shall remove the applicable conditions from the REPC in writing within the agreed time frame, or by failing to respond in writing to the seller's notice, allow the REPC to automatically become canceled, in which instance the earnest money deposit or deposit shall be released to the buyer. So the seller's going to sign this, you're going to send it over to them. Once you've sent it, again, I would do a phone call, shoot a text, make sure that you're, providing that, hey, we've just submitted over to you the notice. And I think it's a good idea to say, so you've got until whatever date at 5 p.m. to remove your conditions. That way you've got proof that you not only have you sent it, but you gave them notice that it had been sent as well. Okay. So once they get this, then that time clock is going to start. And then if the buyer is going to remove the conditions, they have this notice from the buyer to the seller of the removal of conditions. So they're going to fill this out. This is the buyer's notice to the seller. Removal of buyer's conditions is provided by the buyer to the seller with the purchase contract reference date of and the property address. And then again, addendum number, whichever number this was back here for the option to keep the property on the market. You're going to put that number there, contains an option to keep the house on the market. And the buyer, this buyer's notice informs the seller that the buyer removes all conditions checked in section 1.b of the option to keep the house on the market. Buyer signs it, sends it over. If they do that, then all those conditions are removed. That contract just continues on. And again, if they don't send this over within the specified time frame, removing their conditions, then as it said back here, it automatically cancels the REPC and the earnest money is released to the buyer. So any questions on any of those forms, thoughts,
I have
comments?
one question.
Sure.
So say you're on the seller side, you get an offer, and how do you respond to that? Do you have to do an addendum saying it's contingent upon the primary offer, not being able to remove their conditions, or is there a form?
So yeah, really probably the best bet is to just use the backup offer addendum. And then I would just communicate with the other agent of, hey, we're going to enact the time clause. You'll be in the backup position. As soon as we get notice of them either removing or not removing, then we would give you that notice that you're now the primary offer.
I would
Okay.
say for sure, if you're going to put it in a backup position, use the backup addendum, because there's a lot of things the backup addendum addresses, like timetables for your contract and all of this disclosure. So if you're going to work with a backup offer, don't try to write an addendum, just use that addendum. The other thing I see on this time clause one, a lot of us try to think of it just as, oh, they have a home to sell, so I want to keep marketing it. But if there's conditions that a buyer's put on there, like, oh, I want to do a really long due diligence because I don't have something going on, you can use this time clause regardless of whether or not they have a home for sale. If your seller wants to keep marketing it and give you the right to take a backup offer, you might put this in there without a subject to sell. It doesn't need to have that in order for you to use it.
Yeah, good point. So yeah, for example, if there was appraisal, some concern or whatever, that you could throw in this option to keep the property on the market time clause for something other than just the buyer having the property to sell. And just to point out on that actually is why it says here financing and, if applicable, subject to sale. So if you were using it and there's not a subject to sale, then that would automatically discount that. So, great question. Any other thoughts or questions?
I got one unrelated to this, if that's okay.
Sure.
Russ, you and I talked the other day, but I want to just maybe talk, if you could share a little bit about agent service areas and agents compensating each other outside of the brokerage, if you could address those.
Yeah. So yeah, Mike had called me the other day. Just kind of, it's a good idea just to remember, and I'm even going to take it a little bit step further from this. If we have a fiduciary duty of reasonable care and diligence, and part of that fiduciary duty in terms of reasonable care and diligence is making sure that you're giving your client the best care possible. And we see this with having offices that are basically the whole state, with office in St. George, and then we've got Mike working up in the basin, to where agents will come across a property, and a lot of times they don't want to refer it out because of course they want to keep the commission, and so they will then call up Mike or one of the people on his team and say, hey, I got a buyer, can you go let them in the property? And that really is not going to be giving your clients their fiduciary duties. And specifically, if you talk about St. George area, there are issues that local agents would be aware of that somebody from Salt Lake may not be aware of. And you could put your client in a bad spot by just trying to say, hey, you go open the door and then I'm going to write the offer for him, and those type of things. So just keep in mind, you're always going to be better off doing the referral, and especially even with Mike, like if it's a Century 21 Everest agent that's going up there, he's willing to talk to you about the referral fee and, work with you on it depending on what the scenario looks like. So anyway, yeah, thank you for reminding me on that. When I saw you were on, I was thinking that was a good idea to bring that up of just remember you owe your clients that fiduciary duty. And part of that duty is to make sure they're getting the right reasonable care taken care of.
Well,
So
if I could just add one thought to that as well is if an agent that is, let's just say it's me or one of the agents here, and we do act on what that agent in the city is asking, we do not have, so the brokerage may have a brokerage agreement, but hopefully they do by that point. But the agent that's opening the door is opening themselves up for liability as well, because they're not the listed agent on.
I think we lost you there. We caught most of that, but yeah, no, he's gone, I guess. I mean, he's still on, but muted. So yeah, just keep in mind, I mean, really it would be okay because of the brokerage agreement, because the buyer broker is with the brokerage. And so we could reassign an agent and stuff, but I would still just say you are putting yourself at risk for sure, because potentially that person is going to maybe say something that they shouldn't say. You run the risk that way.
So I have a question.
Sure.
So say you're just out of town and you are have an agent like filling in for you.
Yeah,
Can't
no,
have
that's,
some extra homes for you while you're out of town
yeah,
or
absolutely.
buyers.
Yep. Yeah, that's just it. That's where I'm saying the listing agreement, the buyer broker is with the brokerage. And so the agents within the brokerage would be okay. The only thing really that you would have to
Okay.
maybe think about a little bit on it would be more so on the listing side of where sometimes
Okay.
we might cross a line is like on a listing. If I was going out of town and I was going to have you watch my listing while I'm gone, and maybe I give you information about the seller that I really shouldn't, if I haven't gotten permission from the seller, is where sometimes that could open up a possible issue that, maybe I say, oh, look, the seller, hey, I'm going out of town, but just so you know, these guys got a foreclosure looming. They got to get it sold really quick. Well, now all of a sudden you really technically become a sub agent of the seller in that scenario if you were to write an offer with a buyer, but that's getting way off in the weeds. So I would just say, yeah, for sure, if you're going out of town, you can have an agent take care of your stuff. Just make sure they are with Everest.
Russ, thanks for addressing that. I appreciate it.
Yep, you're welcome. All right, guys, anything else? Well, thank you all for being here. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.